Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's particularly meaningful for me to be here because my Uncle John was always an inspiration to me. I found out early on he went to school at night, worked during the day, I believe, so he could then pay for his brother's college, and his brother did the same for his brother. And that's a tradition, I think, of the McCabe family that was very inspiring. Also on the Calacanis side, the Greek side, an incredibly hard work ethic was presented to me at a very young age, both by my father, making us do every job in the restaurant from the age of about 7 or 8 on. It's not legal anymore. Sorry, Dad. But then also watching my uncles, work very hard, and my aunts and my grandmother and grandfather, rest in peace. So it's just great to be here. And I always remember Uncle John, like when you would host Christmas, New Year's, or any event when Monica was hosting Easter, I would always, even at the age of 12 or 13, just gravitate to my Uncle John and ask him questions about business, because I thought he was the most impressive business person I ever met, and it was true. And really, 50 years of teaching is just such an extraordinary accomplishment, and I think that deserves a giant round of applause. 50 years. And so when he asked me to do this, it was incredible. But I was being born at the right time in the right place, I think, is very important in terms of success. We're very lucky to be born in America, yourself included. In a century where the economy boomed and anything was seemingly possible. I was doubly lucky to be born at a time when computers, as we just heard, Morgan Stanley taking Apple public, I was 7 or 8 years old around that time, and I had gone to Ridgewood, New Jersey with my cousin Billy and cousin Eddie, who are here, and cousin Billy and I were in computer camp together, he remembers, and they had these little TRSR 80s.
You did a little better than I did.
Yeah. Still hope for you. Still hope for you, Bill. And we would sit there and play with computers in the summer. I don't even remember if you remember that. We'd sit there and write computer code, and then the computers would get turned off. The next day we'd have to come in and write the code over again. And I was fascinated by that. Also fascinated by video games at a young age. So my dad had bought us an Atari. He had video games in the bar, Beards, where we grew up in Bay Ridge. And I had begged my mom and dad to get me an IBM PC Junior. And my dad came home from work, which most dads come home from work at 5 or 6. My dad also came home at typically 6 or 7. He worked a little bit harder, but it was AM because he would be closing the bar. And he said, all right, fine, you want the computer, I'll go get it with you. And he just grabbed a wad of cash out of the register, and he drove me down to 42 Broadway to a computer store.
His father's back there.
Right there.
I want to tell you, he's not an accountant, but he's a good entrepreneur.
Yeah, he's a great entrepreneur. And they grabbed a bunch of cash, and they bought me an IBM PC Junior, and I started my journey just understanding what computers were. And in 1988, I was faced with going to Brooklyn College, or maybe Fordham, and I decided, like you, having seen that it could be done, to go to school at night and work during the day. I went to Fordham. It took me 4.5 years. But I got to work in the computer room, and somebody said, hey, come here, I'm talking to this girl in Brazil. I said, where? And she said, on the computer. I said, how? And he said, ARPANET. And I said, what's ARPANET? He said, well, they took all the computers in all the colleges and connected them together, and then it's also connected to the Defense Department's network called DARPA. This is 1988. Mm-hmm. And that was the precursor to the internet, as everybody knows. DARPA and the internet got put together, and he said, watch, send, put in the IP address, what did you have for breakfast? Boom. And it said hopping, Miami, Costa Rica, boom, all of a sudden it's in Brazil. And then a minute later, he got a response from this girl. I was like, wow, this is incredible. You can meet girls? That was one way to, this is before Tinder, you have to remember. And I knew what the internet was, and I needed to pay for college. And so I was spending half my time in one job called being a barback, and the other half of the time, which is the worst job you could ever have. It's basically carrying cases of beer and ice up and downstairs all day. So I was doing that at the Salty Dog for $40, $50 a shift. Cash, though, which is pretty good.
Off the books.
Off the books.
Subterranean economy.
Exactly. And then, I started fixing laser printers and got into computers, and I got very lucky in that regard because if you knew what the internet was in the early 90s,
Well, your timing was superb.
it was superb. And I wound up working at Amnesty International, Fordham, Amnesty International, and then Sony. And when I was at Sony, the internet happened. And there were two people in the building who knew what the internet was. So they said, hey, can you come upstairs? Mickey Schulhoff is having a meeting about the internet. And I said, sure. Mickey Schulhoff was the head of the music labels. And we went upstairs and they said, what do we do about this? And they showed a web page. And it said Billy Joel fan page. And it had all the Billy Joel albums. And they said, this kid, we don't know, I think it's Caltech or something, he put up a web page for Billy Joel. What should we do? And one guy says, well, it's copyright infringement, we have to sue him. And the other person says, like, well, we can call the university, we could sue them, we could shut it down. And then they said, well, what do you think? And I looked at Tommy Mottola and this other person, and I just said, well, pretty well designed, can we hire him? And the whole room was quiet. I thought, I nailed it. And they were like, oh, and just turned around and like, let's get this kid out of the room. They wound up hiring him, was the punchline. And I, as you know, started a magazine at the time. And I don't know what possessed me, but since a very early age, I was very interested in the concept of money and power and how that accumulated. And as best I can tell is because I had neither of those things growing up. And when I would come into the city, and it's interesting, I went to Crown Heights today and got some brisket with my rabbi, true story. I'm not Jewish, I didn't convert, don't worry. I'm still Irish. Irish side of the family distinct. I'm not converted.
Anybody have oxygen?
Just an aside. And I was taking the Manhattan Bridge over on the B train, or the Q or something, and I had this flashback. I didn't understand how power was created, but I had seen magazines. And I thought to myself, how does somebody get on the cover of a magazine? That's power. Like, so I would get these magazines, I'd sit there in these cafes and I'd read the magazines, and then I saw the masthead. Now I'm from Brooklyn, like, you were the most successsul person I knew for a long time, and still are. And I'm looking at this masthead, and I'm like, what's a publisher? What's an editor-in-chief? What's a manager? What's an editor-at-large? And I just study it and think about how do I get on that masthead? And so I met somebody who had a magazine named Paper, and he let me write a column about the internet. And then I said, you know what? Fuck it. I just got to start my own magazine. And I don't know what possessed me to think I could start a magazine at that age. But I went over here to 47th Street to the Village Printer, and I just printed up in Photoshop, and I called it Silicon Alley Reporter. And I had two investors in the magazine, American Express and Visa, were my first two investors, and I printed up 1,000 copies of the magazine, staple stitched, and I thought it was going to be like $700 or $800, and the guy behind the counter at 1 in the morning, because it was 24-hour printing, said, that'll be $1,800. And I said, wait, you said it was $800. He said, well, there's tax, and it's $800 for a photocopy. I said, yeah, 8 pages. He said, well, you did double-sided, so it's double. You have to pay for each side. Yeah. I said, I don't have that kind of money. And so then I got this big debate with him, and I started talking to him, and he's like, all right, I'll just charge you $800. And then I realized I was good at negotiating. And I just took that magazine around town, and talk about timing. It was 1995, and I started a magazine about the internet. There were only 2 other magazines about the internet, Mondo 2000 in Boston, and this upstart in San Francisco called Wired. And the magazine went from a 16-page photocopy to a 300-page color glossy, and in the peak year did $11.6 million in revenue with no investors or anything. And so it was really like hitting the wave at the perfect time. So hard work, sure, a lot of luck and a lot of timing and a lot of opportunities, I think, is how I got started. And journalism is a great precursor to being an investor, because when you're a journalist, you're basically interviewing people and trying to figure out what's the truth, what's reality. And a lot of these people have been media trained, and they're spinning, and so you have to get multiple points of view on it and then assess the business and write a story about it. And then you write a story and everybody hates you and you make no money. And then when you're an investor, you get multiple points of view, you do a bunch of interviews, and then you write a check, and then if it wins, you make millions of dollars. So it's the same exact skill set, just I got lucky to be in the right place at the right time, I think.
Okay, now let's go out to San Francisco.
Yeah.
Oh, let's go to LA next.
Yeah.
So tell us about, the end of Silicon Valley, Alley, and the beginning of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, so this was really crushing for me because at the peak, I had been offered $20 million for Silicon Alley Reporter, and I didn't take it Because being young and naive, I thought, well, trees obviously grow to the moon, so you just keep growing your tree until it touches the moon. And it actually doesn't work that way, and sometimes you do want to take chips off the table. When the dot-com bust happened, and my brother Jamie helped me with the magazine as we were winding it down, we went from $11.6 million in revenue and maybe 80 employees at the peak to 4 or 5 of us and 400 or 500K in revenue. And we basically, and then 9/11 happened. So we had the dot-com bust in 2000 in the spring, and then 9/11 the next year. And talk about a double whammy on the economy. And everybody just thought the internet was a fraud. Entrepreneurship, venture capital was all just a complete Ponzi scheme and fraud. And everybody went on vacation. And I wound up selling to Dow Jones. Jamie was the steward for the publication after that for a decade. And I was burnt out. I was really traumatized by 9/11, like a lot of people in the room. And I just started thinking, well, what's next? Is there something big? And 2 of my employees, one of them was named Rafat and the other one was named Sheni, had left and they started doing blogs. And I was like, you know, these blogs are ridiculous. Like, nobody edits you. You're just putting up your opinion. You have no editor. It'll never amount to anything. And then I talked to them and they were like, yeah, we're making like $4,000 or $5,000 a month. And I said, but wait a second, you're making $50,000 a year doing this? I was paying you like $30,000 or $40,000 doing it. Explain everything to me. And so they explained it and I was like, all right, I have the idea. I'm going to build a blog company. So I had made friends with a subject of one of my stories I had written when I said, broadcast.com is $1 billion of hot air. And that was about Mark Cuban's company. And I said, this is totally overvalued. He's got $10 million in revenue, $1 billion valuation. And he called me up. He was really upset at me. And then we became friends. And I emailed him. I said, Mark, I'm doing a blogging company. Are you interested in investing? And he said, sure, I'll put 100K in. And then his attorney said, Mark wants to put 200K in. And I said, okay. And then he said, can you put 300 in? And I was like, sure. So he put 300K in. He bought 15% of the business. We built this blog company. And nobody had jobs then. So it was a really dark time. And we got about 18 months into it. And Ted Leonsis called me from AOL, who I had also met. And he said, hey, my Greek brother, we really like what you're doing with this publishing. We think publishing is the future of AOL and Yahoo and all these other assets. We want to buy your company. And I said, okay, that's interesting. And I had in my mind, I worked 10 years on the last one. I got offered $20 million, and I wound up with 2 years' salary. Okay, I need to sell this one as quick as possible. And because at that time, I had just asked my wife to marry me, and I was at negative 10,000 on my credit cards. But I like to gamble. I like being negative. I kind of play best. Like, I'm really stuck on poker this year. I had like such a winning year the last 2 years. And sorry, Mom. I'm like stuck a lot of money this year on poker. And I always play much better when I'm stuck. I don't know why it is, the pressure. And I got on the phone with them and I was chatting with my partner, Brian, and they said, well, what number are you thinking about? I'm on the phone with the business development people. And Brian said, I said, I think we can get $10 million. And Brian says, really? I said, I actually think we might be able to get like $20 million. My friend Brian's like, you're crazy. Like, we have $100,000 in total revenue. I said, but they really need it. And there's like 8 people on the phone call, and the number 2 guy called me. So this is legit. They need us. And I remember somewhere I heard, whatever you want to get, just double it and then work backwards. And like sometimes things stick in your head, and that was one of the things that stuck in my head. So they said, okay, so what are you thinking? And I said, 40 million. And my friend Brian texts me, you fucking idiot, you blew the deal. God damn it, Jason. And they said, well, we're thinking 30. And my friend Brian goes, you're a genius. And
all right, how long did you have the company?
18 months.
30 million in 18 months? Good.
And so, we sold the company, and they buy the company, and they said, and they had done this with Dow Jones as well, Jamie remembers. The day after Dow Jones bought the previous company, the guy in charge, like this mid-level manager, says, hey, can I take you for a walk? I said, sure. He's like, you know what? You're so talented. We really think the world of you at Dow Jones, Jason. But you've built a spectacular, but we think there's so much that you can do with your life, and we don't want to hold you back. And I was like, thanks for that, yeah. And I really want to make this successful. And they're like, yeah, and we want you to be successful, and we think you should go spread your wings and do that. And I said, are you firing me? And he said, well, we just think you would be better off, and we just wanted to know if we could keep your brother Jamie. Like, if you leave, is Jamie going to stay? Because he was running all the sales, and they were terrified that he would leave while the salespeople would leave. And I said, but you owe me 2 years' salary. He goes, well, we're going to pay it for you. And he takes an envelope out and he hands me a check for $350,000. And I was like, okay, well, good luck. Jamie's totally staying. He's awesome. Bye.
Yeah.
And so they buy the company, AOL buys the company, and they said, listen, we need Brian Alvey for 4 years, we need this person for 4 years.
Now, can I just interrupt? Brian Alvey is another Xaverian graduate, right?
A Xaverian graduate. He was in school with Jamie, and he worked for me a couple times, and then I made him the partner on this one because I had no money. He was a tech genius. He was like 10 times smarter than me. I said, listen, I have no money to pay you, but come work for me and do this Weblog Zing thing. Maybe we'll get rich. And it worked out. But when AOL bought the company, they did the same thing. They were like, okay, we need everybody to sign this. And then, And I was like, well, what about me? And they're like, yeah, we wish you luck in your entrepreneurial career. And I was like, wow, and I realized, if you act crazy, you can sell these companies and not go to work for them. They just thought I was too much of a wild card to have in the company. It's pretty hysterical. And so, and to drop a funny story, at Time Warner at the time, every division had a plane. And so when they bought AOL, they were like, here's your Gulfstream. So the CEO had a Gulfstream, John Miller. And he would fly back and forth, and he always liked to have me fly on the plane with him to talk about internet stuff. And so I'm flying back with him, and he's like, listen, your 1 year anniversary, are you going to stay for the second year? And I have a couple projects you can work on. And I was like, yeah, I got a couple of ideas of things I want to do. And he's like, well, what would it take to make you stay? I was like, can I be president on the board? And he looked at me and goes, that would be the best idea I could ever do, but I could never actually pull that off. That would probably be like super inspired if I did that, but there's no way I could make you president of the company. Everybody would quit who worked for me. And I was like, okay. So I left. And then I started a company with Sequoia.
Tell them a little bit about Sequoia.
Yeah.
Are we moving into venture capital now?
Well, what happened was I had a couple of ideas for websites, and I emailed and I said, you know what, I'm going to do this next website. Who are the top 3 people? Because I didn't know what venture capital was. And so I emailed Mark and I said, hey, I'm going to do a new company. He's like, great, here's $1 million. I was like, wow, good to have Mark Cuban as a friend. Then we had made, that $300K he invested turned into $6 million. So he was like, okay, I'll take the 5 and you take $1 million for your next company. That was pretty great of him. And so I was like, who are the 2 most powerful venture capitalists? And I look on the Midas list or something. It says Michael Moritz and John Doerr. So I emailed Michael Moritz and I emailed John Doerr, basically the same email.
John Doerr was at Kleiner Perkins?
John Doerr was at Kleiner Perkins. And I said, my name is Jason Calacanis. I sold my last company to AOL for $30 million in 18 months. I'm doing my next company. I was wondering if I could get your advice and share the idea with you. Because I knew short was better than long. And my phone rings, like on both of my numbers, and I get an email from Michael Moritz, the most powerful venture capitalist in the world, within 1 hour, and John Doerr the next day. And I'm in their offices the next week, and they both wanted to invest in the company, and Sequoia wound up doing it. Funny story with John Doerr. I go to the meeting. This is a seriously powerful venture capitalist, guy who did Google and Yahoo. And he shows up for the meeting, and his arm's in a sling. He's got a bandage on his head and a bandage on his arm. And in the meeting, I'm going through my deck, and I'm telling him my idea. This is back when venture capitalists would invest in an idea. And he starts falling asleep. Like over and over again. And I'm like, well, that didn't go well. So I'm leaving, and one of the partners pulls me aside. He goes, I know John fell asleep a couple times in the meeting. He was biking this morning. He was doing this like 30, 40-mile bike ride, and he went over the handlebars. He dislocated his shoulder, and he's on like a bunch of painkillers. We told him not to come to the office, but he said he needed to be here because he could never miss an appointment with the founder that was on the books. And I bookmarked that one. Okay, it's a service-based business. When you're an investor, it's a service-based business. Like you're in service of the founder. And long story short, the company I did with Sequoia did okay, but I had introduced them to 3 of my friends and said, you should invest in these 3 companies. One of them was a poker game online that my friend Mark was doing. And it was called like Facebook Poker at the time. And he changed the name to the name of his dog, Zynga. And I told them, you got to invest in this. And they didn't. Then my other friend came to me and he said, hey, can I have brunch with you? I want to show you what I'm doing. And he had created a company called Blogger. So we knew each other from the blogging world. And I said, okay, tell me about the new company. So we'll take your BlackBerry out. I took my BlackBerry out. He said, text 40404, join at Jason. I said, okay, I did it. He goes, okay, now type, text to 40404 what you're having for breakfast. And I said, okay, I'm having the Eggs Benedict. And he goes, okay, Biz is going to text what he's having, and I'm going to text what I'm having. And I look at the BlackBerry and it goes, ding, ding, and it sends me a message of what they're having for breakfast. And I looked at Evan and I said, Evan, you're going backwards in your career. You took the blog post and you removed the blog and you left the headline. I don't know what you're doing with this Twitter thing, but it's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. This is going to be a cacophony of idiots. And this just cost me 2 cents because it cost a penny per thing. I'm not going to invest in Twitter. What is it called? And it's Twitter. And he said, well, it's not going to cost a penny because we're going to move it to the web because Apple's coming out with this app store, but it's all going to be on the web and you don't have to pay for it. And I was like, you know what, Evan, I got to give you a piece of advice. Like, enabling stupid people to talk incessantly and not even make full sentences, let alone paragraphs or have a thesis. Do you realize what this is going to enable in the world? This giant cacophony of stupidity. And it was literally a $25 million mistake. And I was right, because it is a cacophony of idiots led by an idiot. Yeah. But that's when I learned like one of the most important lessons of investing. It's not your opinion of the idea. And the more outlandish the idea is, and the more polarizing it is, the greater the likelihood of it being an outlier. Not the greater the likelihood of success. Actually, it would be less likely of success, but it would be a chance of an outlier. And then the third one, my friend had invested in this Atom electric car, and he put $50 million of his own money into it, and they couldn't deliver the car, so he had to take over as CEO, and Sequoia didn't invest in that company. That was Tesla, famously. So after 3 times of me sending those emails, they said, hey, if we gave you some money and we split the returns 50-50, would you be a scout for us? And I said, well, what do I have to do? And they said, we have to write a deal memo. Here's the deal memo for YouTube. And Ruloff, who was working for Moritz at the time, sent me this deal memo for YouTube. I said, this thing's like 12 pages. I'm not writing a 12-page memo. And he's like, well, you can just do it like a page. And I was like, if I'm investing $25K, who cares? Somebody invested 25. And he said, well, it would be helpful if you wrote the deal memo. I was like, all right, whatever. Fine, I'll do it. And so my friend was starting this company, Uber Cab, and he let me put $25K in. And they said, you got to fill out this deal memo. So they said, what's the thesis behind the company, blah, 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 blah. And I wrote, and basically it was, why should this company exist? And I said, because taxis suck. But I had written like 3 sentences, and then I just kept trying to write it in less and less words. So I was basically trolling the person who was about to make my career, which was stupid but funny. And so when Sequoia recently sent out the distribution, they included the deal memo with, because cabs suck. And that's when I realized, like, I was built for angel investing because it plays off of all the things that are my skills. I like to take a large amount of risk. I like to be there at the inception of something. I like to be supportive and of service to people who are maniacal and crazy and want to change the world. And listening to people every day tell you their crazy idea is the greatest job in the world. Yeah. Like literally I get to hang out with the smartest people in the world and have them explain to me how they're going to change the world. And 1 out of 100 times they do.
So you have a front row seat on the people that are going to change the world.
Yeah, and
which that means, though, you have to have a perceptive ability. So one of your skills is the ability to size up people.
Yeah, big time.
Perfectly. And because, if you want to put on the board there, let's do the decline curve. We'll give Jason a little bit of a break. But this, if you've had any of our classes, if you had any classes at the college and so on, this is fascinating to me. Because this is a corporation, an institution, and so on. Here's the life cycle. You go from innovation to exploitation to maturation and then to a decline. Unlike humans, though, corporations can reverse their life cycle. What Jason and I are going to be talking about next is this is where Jason trolls and this is where I troll.
Yeah.
So my companies have to be public, so they have to know something about corporate governance.
Yeah.
And Kolodnik doesn't know a hell of a lot about corporate governance.
We got a problem.
Tesla doesn't know a hell of a lot about corporate governance.
It's challenging.
We workers, people ought to go in jail. Okay,
Yeah.
right. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. But I'm always fascinating where some companies can reverse their life cycles. And this is when we use the term capitalism. Capitalism is a loser's game in the sense that if you can cut your losses, the momentum of the system makes you a winner. It outpaces socialism anytime. And this debate we got going on now between capitalism and socialism is not really a debate at all. But what I would recommend, anytime you use the term capitalism, put private property next to it. Because nobody washes or rent a car. If you own it, you'll build it, will create jobs. And one of the functions we have at the college, since it's a college that's basically first generation, they talk about how did I get there in 1968. I came in 1968. Can you believe that? You know what the number one consumer technology innovation was that year?
Wow.
Pampers.
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 I was going to go with like color television.
You don't have to use diapers anymore. So that was the innovation back in those days. It was an interesting time because Jason is also in a think type atmosphere where you talk about what the future of the country is going to look like. When I started teaching at St. Francis in 1968, that was the year 12 women became the first females at St. Francis. It took this country so long to realize where the brain power is. Okay? Now 60% of the students are female. There are 2.2 million more females in higher education and college than there are males. Women are only 7% of the federal prisoners. Oh, what are the rest? Could they be males? So it's an interesting world. So I want to move back to Jason, and I want to talk about unicorns.
Yeah.
And then we'll get to some of the people you know, and then we want to talk about things that maybe we can change the world with. So go ahead, Jason. Tell us about unicorns.
Okay, well, unicorn was just a term that came up in the last couple of years because we've had so many companies reach the milestone of $1 billion in valuation. Now, that doesn't mean the company's making $1 billion or will trade at $1 billion. It means some private investors think it has a value of $1 billion, and they're placing a bet that it would go. Typically, the people placing that bet at $1 billion are looking for somewhere between 2 and 20x return. So they're placing a bet at $1 billion, hoping it gets to 20. And it's such a clever name that it inspired a lot of people to kind of look at that as a milestone. The milestone we actually look at internally at our firm, which is called Launch, and we look for companies that we believe can get to $50 million to $100 million in revenue a year with a great profit margin, 30, 40, 50%, within 7 to 10 years. So that's the lens that we look at the world. It happens to be that people will also value those companies at $1 billion in most cases. But we really don't care too much about that. We care about just finding those companies that can grow at that velocity. Now, you brought up corporate governance, and you brought up a little bit of maybe what happens between those private markets and the public markets. The private markets are filled with capital that is designed to take risk. And the public markets are filled with capital, much of which is designed to mitigate against risk, but to get a return that beats inflation. Am I correct?
Yes.
Ballpark correct? I think it was a pretty good way to describe it. So if you look at the money being put to work in Silicon Valley, we're looking for 9 out of 10 companies to go to zero and 1 out of 10 to maybe have an extraordinary return, or maybe 1 out of 50 or 100 to have an otherworldly return. That's not what public market investors are typically looking for. They're looking to keep up with inflation, maybe sometimes beat it, 7, 8, 9% a year. So after taxes, it's 5, 6, or 7, and have a great retirement. And so weird things can happen in the private markets, because in the public markets, you can't trade on private information. In the private market, that's the definition of all information is private. Like almost everything is private. And we have a saying, no conflict, no interest. We operate under the idea that we want to get an edge on everybody else, that we want our fund, our investors, our co-investors, our team to get rich at the expense of putting other companies out of business. Right? Like we're in the business of disrupting other companies, and we say your margin is our opportunity. So if the cab companies are taking 60% and Uber gets it down to 25%, or Airbnb brings more opportunity for lodging than hotels. We're looking to beat those companies and delight customers and save them money, save them time, or delight them. One of those things, which is something you taught me very early on that great companies do. And it always stuck with me as a lens. But something weird has happened, which is, and it's perverse and it's very concerning to me. And it relates to a much bigger picture, which I think is an important topic for us to discuss. We have, as confounding as capitalism can be for people to understand and to reconcile, is Bezos, should he get paid that much money? Should Bill Gates be worth what he's worth? Of course not. It doesn't make much sense. And are there bad actors like Theranos and WeWork? Of course that's going to happen, and it feels weird. But overall, this system of capitalism plus democracy is the best system that's ever existed in humanity. But then if you look at the systems that haven't worked very well, the Saudis, the Chinese, they're looking and saying, let's take our money and let's invest it in those companies and that system in America. And they came, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the Saudis are realizing there's an end to this oil. Because right now, a solar, retrofitting a coal plant is more expensive than putting in a solar plant. And it's only a matter of time before solar and wind, it literally, I don't worry too much about global warming because the renewables are getting so cheap that it just doesn't even make sense to put in a coal plant anymore. It doesn't make sense to burn oil anymore. It will not make sense to drive an internal combustion engine car anymore. It's just not going to make sense. So the Saudis and the Chinese, authoritarian regimes, are saying this country's a better bet. Our countries are a bad bet. We want their economics. We want their companies. We want their entrepreneurs. We want their workers. Now let that sink in for a second. They have unlimited capital, billions of people, trillions of dollars in dead dinosaurs in the ground, and they want our system. And then you're an entrepreneur and somebody comes over the top and says, oh, these venture capitalists are offering you, $100 million for 10% of your company. I'll give you $500 million. Now, what's an entrepreneur to do in that one transaction, in that micro moment? It's very hard for a founder to say no to SoftBank, which is a proxy for Saudi money, or at least in the first fund was 60% of it, I believe. And this perverted everything because they're playing with funny money. This is monopoly money that doesn't really have a value. And then you have young entrepreneurs who really, maybe they're running businesses for the first time. Now you layer on governance to this weird situation that's occurred. And there was a moment in time where breakout companies, Facebook and Google would be the two best examples, as the venture capitalists were leaving the boards. And as a thank you to the founders, now imagine you're Larry and Sergey or you're Zuckerberg and I'm the investor, venture capitalist, and you made us 10 or $50 billion. We're leaving the board, taking our chips and selling them. We're done. We're going to buy planes and we're going to give the Ford Foundation and Harvard and MIT and all these endowments their distributions. Oh, you have a request for us? You want to get 100-to-1 voting shares? And we're the board? Great. Thanks for the $10 billion. Here's your super voting shares. We're out. Now these boards get inherited. And then in Silicon Valley, I started to have entrepreneurs saying, yeah, I'll do this deal. I want 100-to-1 voting shares. And I'm like, one person, one vote. One share, one vote. I'm not willing to do this kind of crazy cockamamie nonsense. But the investors, and we were flooded with capital because it's a peak market, the bad investors would then say, you know what, I don't have much to offer versus the top investors, so I'll offer, you get to have control of your company. You get to have super voting shares. You get to do whatever you want. And lo and behold, bad behavior. Well, what's going to happen when you give a 30-year-old who's running a company for the first time and you tell them they're a genius and you tell them their company's worth $1 billion and that they're worth $300 million and then you give them total control? History has shown us that maybe it's better to have a voting-based system than a dictatorship. So we basically instituted the dictatorship system inside of corporate governance. It is a very bad idea.
Yeah, well, let me go to another thing we'll talk about. I think one of the challenges we have for the country today is we have about 50% fewer public corporations today than we did in 1997. But you have to think about, why do companies go public? Well, they want to share the risk with the public. They want some status. The public puts a market capitalization on it, so there's a value there. But think about it another way. You're asking the public to bail out some of these millionaires. And there are no universals, only particulars when you dissect different corporations. But some of the things we've seen along the way, and these are some of your personal friends. So before I get to the specifics of that, tell us a little about how you read Elon Musk. How do you read Travis Kalanick and so on as personalities?
Yeah, I mean, as I tell people, the people who want to change the world are generally going to be strong personalities. And it kind of comes with the entire package. And so Travis was maniacal about winning, and he looked at every city as a challenge to win, and that's why the company became what it's worth. And then other competitors who came before them, like Sidecar or Lyft, were quickly run over by his tenacity, by his execution. And sure, you're going to, all these companies knock stuff over and break stuff in this path to success and changing the world. But proper governance is something that should exist all the time. And it was really, Uber was one of the few times we actually had a shareholder lawsuit in a private company. My very close friend, Bill Gurley, sued Travis, my other close friend. This was very challenging for me. Two of my very close friends suing each other in Delaware court over these issues. And of course, a settlement occurred. Big picture, we need to just think about governance and some high standards. And the public markets, I think we can be very proud of them. They looked at something like WeWork and they were like, this doesn't make sense to us, and it collapsed. They looked at Uber
well, let's
and
think
Lyft.
about WeWork for a second. I've been on Wall Street an awful long period of time. I've never seen the market capitalization of a company drop from $48 billion to $8 billion in 30 days. Where was the SEC? Where was the investment bankers? Who were the corporate finance people that wrote up that preliminary prospectus? When there's so much money available for people, it's insane. We're going to have an accident. Capital gravitates to its most efficient use, and it stays where it's welcome. The hurdle rates to spend money today are so low. The after-tax cost of capital on a 3% bond is about equal to the rate of inflation. There's so much free money out there that we could have a debacle. And we are in the, we've had...
Could or will.
Well, I'll get there. We had 11 recessions since World War II. That means we're in the 12th economic recovery. And we're hoping, Trump keeps talking about the stock market and so on and so forth. But the problem is, are we really going to have an accident? And you know more about free money than I do, but before you get there, I have never seen anybody do this. This gentleman here has invested in 6 unicorns, and they're all off the charts. Now, I happen to know a little bit about Thumbtack, and I know a little bit about Uber. Who are the other 4?
So a database company called DataStax, a meditation company called Calm.com, which I'm particularly proud of that investment. That will actually exceed the returns on Uber if it continues along this way. I just had somebody on my podcast this week in startups named Alex, and he had this idea to do a meditation app, and I think he had made maybe $5,000 or $10,000 in that month. And he asked me to invest in the company, and I had known a neuroscientist. We had the same book author, and this neuroscientist's name was Sam Harris, who now is very famous for his podcast and his books. And he had put me in touch with the UCLA Mindfulness Center. So when I was doing my diligence on Calm, I talked to them, and I was like, wow, they're training Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal how to meditate before and after games, to do mindfulness. Phil Jackson, the Zen master, it's being studied. They're doing MRIs. I was like, okay, I know that this sounds kind of crazy, but I think that the world, with all of this anxiety, depression, mental health issues, modern life, meditation will be good for them. So I started practicing, some basic meditation, and we put $378,000 in that company for 6 or 7%. It was a $4 or $5 million valuation. And the founder told me, hey, the company was going to go out of business if you didn't give us that money. And sure enough, the company's worth $1.2 billion now. They're going to do $160 or $180 million in revenue this year from 2 million people just paying $60 a year for the subscription. Now, this seems crazy, but 2 million people can't be wrong. That's very strong product market fit. And these are consumers paying, not advertisers, no games. And it's a company with under 50 employees. So you start to think of the revenue per employee at these companies.
Yeah.
And when Instagram was bought for $1 billion, they had, I think, 24 employees at the time. I missed that investment too. That was a brutal one. And Robinhood was another crazy story. I went to a bar in Palo Alto after a speaking gig. And it's the worst, most dive bar you could ever imagine. Eddie and Billy, I'll see you there when you're in town. My cousins, inside joke. So I go to this dive bar, Antonio's Nut House in Palo Alto. Do not go if you go to Palo Alto. And this kid walks up to me and he says, you're Jason Calacanis. I said, tell me about your startup. He said, how do you know I have a startup? I said, well, you recognize me, so you obviously watch the podcast. And they said, yeah, we watched the podcast in high school and college, and we're quants. I said, what's a quant? And he said, you don't know what a quant is? I said, I kind of know, it's quantitative analysis, but what does it exactly mean? This is before the TV show Billions and whatever. Exactly, guys who put it out of business. So he explains it to me, and I said, all right, hit me with your idea. He says, we want to create an app for individuals. I said, who? He said, millennials, to trade stocks. I said, you realize like boomers and Gen Xers, there's no retail market for stocks, and you're going to ask millennials to trade stocks? These people are on their parents' Netflix accounts and they're sharing T-Mobile family plans. Like, these people are not, they can't even sign a lease for an apartment. No offense to the millennials in the room. I know that if you're self-selecting because you're here, you're not part of that group. And he said, yeah, that's the big win if we do it. So back to that counter indicator, remember before I said like I missed Twitter? I wasn't going to miss this one because I wasn't thinking about what would go wrong in the business. I was thinking, well, what if it goes right? And this is my big lesson in what I write about in my book is make a big list of 100 things that can go wrong in a company, and then write a list of the 1 or 2 things that could go right that could change the world. Then take the list of 100 things, rip it up, doesn't matter, all these companies have risk, and just focus on those 2. Because they say something in that Indy car racing when they're going around in a circle, which is never look at the wall. There's a reason you don't look at the wall, because you run into it. Like, look at the track in front of you, the road ahead of you. What could go right? And so I said, okay, great. You're going to get millennials to do it. Let's assume that they do it. How do you make money? He goes, oh, that's the greatest thing ever. This is how we're going to get them. We're not going to charge them. It's going to be free. I said, okay, let me just read that back to you, make sure I got it. You're going after a group of people who have no concern for the future and no money. And the way you're going to make money off of them is by letting them trade stocks for free, and E-Trade charges $14 a trade. And he said, yep. I said, I'm in. Because I knew there was something. It was such a compelling vision that if it did work and they got 1 million or 2 million people to start trading stocks on there, well, now they've got these millennials who at some point are going to grow up and care about their future. And what would the prize be? So that's what I'm always thinking is, what is the prize if they do win? Not what is the loss, which is just like in poker. When you're playing in poker and like you play some really weird cards like 7-8, like what if you hit your straight and somebody with aces throws all their chips in and you hit a straight? Like you're going to felt like 2 or 3 people at the table. And that's really that gambler's mentality that you have to have, which is what is the payoff if it does work? And in terms of signaling, of what these founders have, delighted customers is one that can't be faked. And I've seen people try. I will have people come to me and be like, it's off the charts. Like we're just growing like crazy. I'm like, great, give me your top 5 customers. Here's my diligence associate, Presh. He's going to call them, or Nick. He's going to call them, and we'll talk to your customers. And then you see people go like, and I'm like, well, tell me about your first 5 customers. And they're like, well, the first 2 was the company I worked at. The next 2 are my fraternity brothers, and the 5th one is the one that I got through a Facebook ad, or somebody read about us in the press. And I said, okay, let's talk about the 5th. Let's forget the first 4 that you faked. Let's talk about the 5th, 6th, and 7th. So delighted customers, whether it was Uber, Robinhood, Calm, or companies I'm not an investor in like Airbnb or Facebook, are undeniable. Like I heard the idea for Airbnb, and I was like, wait a second. You're telling me I could stay on somebody's couch, and they were like, no, or you could stay in like an extra bedroom or something like that, or like their guest house, and it's like going to be like half as much as a hotel. I'm like, so I can stay at a serial killer's house for half as much as a hotel? He's like, well, there's going to be like a reputation system, and I was like, oh, so a sociopathic like Jeffrey Dahmer type is not going to figure out how to hack. He's going to figure out how to hack people to death and eat them, but not how to hack the reputation system of Airbnb. Like, no, thank you. And then he's like, well, you could also be a host. I was like, oh, so I could wake up in the middle of the night and have a serial killer staying with us? And I could have never understood how that worked. How many people here have stayed in an Airbnb in the last year? Raise your hand nice and high. Okay. So,
how old are you?
Yeah, exactly. If you look at it, there's a whole, generational thing
High
here.
risk, high reward.
Exactly. Well, and that is the perfect example of what if it does work? What if it does work? Well, what if it does work means there's more Airbnbs in Paris than there are hotel rooms now. And young people are able to go to places like Tokyo or Brazil when they probably couldn't have previously because they couldn't have afforded a $200 or $300 a night hotel. And so I think that the customers and freeing yourself from understanding the idea as an investor and just looking at the customer base is another thing that has helped me scale our organization. Because the first 5 years of investing, I did it 2 or 3 hours a month, hit a couple of unicorns, and put $700K to work. This past year, we put $30 million to work and have a team of 12 doing it. And so we've scaled up massively in what we're doing. And so I've had to scale up a bunch and train a team of how to identify these companies and spend a lot of time with them. And we just look for people who can make great products. That's the other thing. If somebody comes to you and makes the perfect steak and you eat it and go, that's delicious, the chances of them doing it again are pretty high. If somebody makes a terrible steak, and they don't know how to cook, they may have to make 100 steaks to get there. So what we do is we look at the product. We know great product. We do interviews with customers. Most investors are lazy and they suspend disbelief, and then they kick the can down the road. It was pretty obvious to me that this was not going to be a great business when they shifted strategy from taking under market buildings, signing long-term leases at very low rates, and then renting at 5 times the price per square foot to people. That was a great business. Then when you see them putting really high-end leases at very high rates in the middle of Soma in San Francisco, I was like, well, wait a second, where's the margin on that?
When I saw them have $1.5 billion in revenues and $1.4 billion in losses.
Yeah.
And they were past the SEC and they were going to go public. I think we all have to realize that the public is made up of 401k people.
Yeah.
It's made up of individuals. You can really injure the public marketplace.
Yeah, you got to take it seriously. And
you got to take it very, very seriously.
That handoff is something that I think I wanted to talk to you about today. Because I think that's something our industry has to get better at, which is if we know the public markets are not interested in growth at all costs, like we are. We're growth at all costs people. We want to see things grow and get big. It's not interesting for us to have Uber in 10 cities. We want to see if we can get it to 1,000. That takes investment and losses.
It does.
But the public market, they want profits.
Well, let's talk about it another way. Companies are taking longer to go public. They used to go public like if it was an Apple or Microsoft 5-6 years. Now it's 9 or 10 years. So it's becoming an exit strategy to give wealth to the people that want to get out. So now you have
employees. Early investors.
I mean, look at what this guy did to those 4,000 employees that are going to be laid off next week, who thought they were going to be living the life of luxury because they were going public.
We have a rule internally, if people want to do what's called secondary shares, if they want to sell shares in private companies, we say, listen, everybody on the cap table needs to sell equally. So if the CEO wants to sell, like he did, some 500 million in shares or whatever it is, okay, and that's whatever percentage of the company, everybody else should be able to sell that percentage. And that, I guess, pari passu kind of concept is something we believe strongly in and we advise people to do. The liquidity and the secondary market has really helped, actually, because what we found was founders were selling their companies too soon. If you look at a company like YouTube, 1.6 billion, and Instagram, 1 billion, those companies as private companies in the public market today would be easily worth 200 billion each, 300 billion each, and would be incredible standalone businesses. But at that time, 10 years ago, this concept of a secondary market coming in and buying out some of the shares and taking a little of that pressure.
I think the WeWork is a watershed moment. It's like in the 1980s when you had Boone Pickens and people like that saying there's more oil on Wall Street than there is in Mesa, in Texas, and so on. We're going to wrap it up a little bit. What I want you them to tell them the story about Elon Musk and how did you get the first car out of him?
Oh, that's a funny story. So I became friends with Elon living in LA. We had a bunch of mutual friends, and it was before he had invested and then taken over as CEO of Tesla. And the financial crisis, and he's told the story, so I'm not speaking out of turn here. He had been getting a divorce at the time, and some gossip website had written that he had a month left of capital in Tesla. He was personally bankrupt, and he just texted me and said, "Hey, want to get dinner?" I was like, "Sure." So we went and got a steak, in our little roadsters, the first car. He had the number 1, which he since shot into space, and I had number 16. And we went out in Los Angeles to get a steak, and we're talking. And I was like, how's it going, pal? And it was not going well for him at the time. And I said, is it true what they said? Like, you only have like a month of, runway, and I can loan you a couple $1,000,000 or something. And he said, no, it's not true. I was like, oh, thank God. He's like, we have 2 weeks. I said, okay. I said, what's going on with the rockets? He said, well, we blew up 2. I said, what happens if you blow up 3? He's like, no more SpaceX. And this is in the financial crisis. And he's also getting divorced. And I said, certainly, Elon, there must be some good news. There's always good news. And he said, well, can I show you something in confidence? I said, yeah, hit me. So he takes out his BlackBerry to date the conversation and starts swiping. And he shows me the clay models of the Model S. And I said, wow, that's beautiful. That's going to change the world if you can make that. Mm-hmm. How much is that going to cost? He said, ultimately, I might be able to build a car like this for $50K. Best case scenario with the discounts and everything, I can get it to $50K. I said, if you can make an electric car for $50K like that, that will change the world. And anyway, we wrapped up, and then I went home to my wife, and I said, you got the checkbook? She said, here. She said, poker debt? I said, no. And so I write a little note to Elon, and I said, Elon, looks like a great car, I'll take 2. And I wrote 2 $50,000 checks. And I put them in a FedEx envelope, and I sent it to him to get there, early that week, because I felt like, my friend, he's down on his luck, and, I should help him out. And I said to Jade, well, we're not going to see that $100,000 again in all likelihood, but it's probably going to pay payroll for 2 days. So, and she goes, oh, you're a good friend. 3 years later, my email pings, ding, your reservation number is 000001. Ding, your reservation number is 000073. Ding. And so I forwarded it to Elon, and I said, you don't have to give me the number 1 car. And he goes, you're the first person to order it, you deserve it. And he goes, I would have given you 1 and 2, but I thought that might be a little gratuitous, whatever. And I was like, no, I'm fine with 73. So my friend Sky Dayton took number 73 off me, and I kept number 1, which is in my house in storage, which I'll probably put in the Smithsonian or something. So that's how I wound up with that car. But he is a fantastic entrepreneur. He's built the best products with the most loyal customer base in the world. He is also a swing for the fences and go hard, as you know. And, it's pretty amazing what's been accomplished right now. I have the self-driving, and he's 80% of the way there. Now, the last 20% is going to be very hard. The edge cases will be very hard. Yeah. But self-driving, in the next 5 years, will become very common in China, where life and death is less important on an individual basis. I mean, it sounds cavalier, but in a country where they're like, we're going to build a super highway and a high-speed train here, and it's like, well, what about the church and the monastery and those statues? They're like, yeah, we're going to build a train right there. Yeah. And they build the train right there. They're going to just let these cars on the road.
But I used to be an automobile analyst, believe it or not. When I got out of NYU Business School, my first job as a security analyst was being an automobile analyst. So I did analyze Ford, Chrysler, and GM, and it's a high fixed cost business like you can't possibly believe. Well, it's a capital intensive business like you can't possibly believe. And the competition is running close on him now. Which way does it end up, Jason?
Yeah, I think he's moving into a phase that'll be high scale, if demand keeps up, and higher margin. And that reminds me of the iPhone. It reminds me of those kind of things. And then if the robo-taxi thing works, Elon is always setting ridiculously aggressive targets. I don't think he's going to have a robo-taxi fleet in the United States next year. He could have it like Waymo does in Arizona in a very confined space. But it's a race that, for self-driving, is going to take 10 years in the United States. So I don't think that will be, I think it's overblown how quickly it's going to come, because the edge cases and the value of life here is very high. But in other markets, it'll be easier. Also, in other markets that have eminent domain, if China all of a sudden says, you know what, this highway is only for self-driving, and we're going to put people in pens like they do over here in Rockefeller Center, where they have the fences in front of Saks now, so people don't get hit by cars. They're just going to pen pedestrians in, and then self-driving actually works really well. Good.
Jason, before we wrap it up,
Yeah.
we've got to talk a little bit about this book. It's been a great success. Jason
Thanks.
is a typical McCabe. He's very interested in education. So tell us about why you wrote that and what your background or theory is on education.
Yeah, so I have a great book author, and I've been getting offers to write like blogging for dummies and podcasting for dummies. And I was like, if you keep sending me these dummy offers, I'm going to start thinking like, I'm going to take it personal. And then my agent was like, listen, there's a lot of people who want you to write a book. Do you have a book in you? And I said, I think you should only write a book if you're an expert on something, like you really have something to say. Yeah. And after doing about 150 investments and hitting 4 unicorns at the time I wrote the book, I was like, this is the time for me to write this. And it really was a passion project. It's now in 3 or 4 languages, and it's going to be in 10, and I'm writing the follow-up to it. And HarperCollins business has been incredible as a publisher. And my goal was really to educate the public on the power of private markets and many hands making for light work, which is one of the phrases my father always said. And I always take notes on like things people tell me that I think are important. Like you told me, save people time, save them money, or make them or entertain them. And Disney was the other thing. I always remember you talking about Disney like 30 years ago.
That was my wife.
Yeah, well, she gets credit for that.
That was Mrs. Mickey Mouse.
That was the best bet you ever made, and I think we know the brains behind that operation.
I'm one of the 7 dwarfs. She's the brains.
Exactly. And I thought this would be a way, for me to pay it forward. And I now, I'll be 49 this year.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Which is kind of crazy to feel.
I thought I was 49.
Exactly. You've been teaching.
Hey, the students never get older, right?
You've been teaching at St. Francis longer than I've been alive.
I know.
It's crazy. And I thought, God, this would be like a great third act for me if I could inspire 10,000 people to become angel investors. Because when you think about capital, the other thing you taught me early on was about monetary velocity, and that money.
You remember the terminology?
I do.
I got some of my best students right in front of you.
Exactly.
They're going to tell their success stories next. Go ahead.
And I was like, there's all this dead money sitting in bonds and real estate and whatever. Wouldn't it be great if 1% of it, 5% of it took high risk bets? Yeah. And people are very scared, and they make a lot of mistakes in angel investing. The typical mistake is their cousins, brothers, aunts, sorority sister has a friend who's starting a photo sharing app that's going to kill Instagram. And they put $250,000 into it. Yeah. It never gets launched. The person asks for another $100,000 to finish it. They give them the $100,000. They lose $350K, and they say angel investing is stupid. And what I did was I came up with a playbook, which was because of syndication, people syndicating deals now, where they share it. People can put like $2,000 or $3,000 into a private company, and if you make 30 of those bets for $2K, study what happens after you've deployed 60,000, and then make 10x bet, say 20K on the top 3 winners. Well, that's what I do for a living. Yeah. And that's now becoming available to accredited investors, which are about 5% of the country. And soon the SEC, in their wisdom, is looking at this and saying, why is it that a poor person